So I'd like to go ahead and get started with introduction so everybody is familiar with each other. I'll go ahead.
Helena, we are now live streaming.
We are now live streaming. Excellent. So live stream, not just recorded, but live stream on YouTube. So there may be the public watching us at this point. So just a heads up there. My name again is Helena Kesh, and I am with the Government Relations and Policy Unit with Oregon State Parks, and I will be leading the effort on updating the general park rules. And I will go ahead and just ask Katie to introduce herself.
Sorry, Katie Guthrie. I'm with the Government Relations and Policy Unit and here to help with tech support.
Okay, and then Pam.
Hi, I'm Pam Reber. I am work in hazard mitigation and formerly with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And my favorite outdoor recreation activity is hiking, and yeah. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you.
Need time to prepare for these things. Thank you.
No worries. Megan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Allman. I'm with the Northwest Association for Blind Athletes. We're based in the Portland, Vancouver area, and favorite outdoor rec activity. We do hiking in some of the Oregon State parks. Right now we're hiking, tandem biking, and doing paddle sports. So that's my favorite today.
Jamie.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jamie Leanne. I'm the Park Ranger Supervisor for Oregon State Parks in the Columbia River Gorge on the west side of the gorge. My favorite outdoor recreation activity right now would have to be kind of lazy river days.
Kim.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim McCarroll. I'm with Oregon Equestrian Trails, and probably not too surprisingly, my favorite outdoor recreation activity is horseback riding.
Perfect. Keta.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Keta Gonzalez, and I'm with the Center for Diversity and the Environment. My favorite outdoor recreation activity is paddling, simply messing about in boats.
Nice. Jen. And is it Jen or Jennifer?
I go by Jen. Jennifer Chen. I'm the program manager at Marion County's Adult Behavioral Health Services. And my favorite outdoor activity is surfing, but not in Oregon.
Cool. Caleb.
Good morning. My name is Caleb Dixon. I'm with Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. My favorite outdoor activity is mountain biking.
Scott.
Hello, I'm Scott Youngblood. I'm Park Manager for Lucky Butte Management Unit, which includes most of the Willamette River Greenway. My favorite outdoor activity, anything involving rivers. And you'll have to forgive me. I have a long ongoing ear infection from allergies this year. And I think I only have about 20% hearing in my right ear currently. So everything sounds like I'm in a river right now. So I may do a lot of whats.
No worries. Thanks for the heads up. Steve.
Yeah, Steve Bufano here, the park manager out at the Cove Palisades State Park out there in Central Oregon, Madras Culver area. And favorite outdoor activity is going to be snow skiing, pretty much all winter long, and then even in the summertime up there at Timberline Lodge. So yeah.
Nice. Thanks, everybody. And I forgot to share what mine was, and it would be hiking. I just love being outside, walking around, and really beginner hiking. I've hiked forever, but I am not climbing any mountains, I'll tell you that. I'll leave it to the experts. So thanks again for joining us. Just to go over some of the history about the general park area rules. and why we're here today. So we internally at Oregon State Parks have taken a look at the rules a couple of times. And primarily, one of the reasons is, first, we have to update our rules at least every 5 years. And that's just a requirement for state agencies. So as a maintenance housekeeping type of a thing, we need to do that. These rules haven't been updated for longer than that. So unfortunately, we're a little behind schedule, and we want to make sure that we're bringing them up to date. But we also wanted to make sure that the rules are reflective of the community that we serve today. So we had an internal work group take a look at the general park rules with an equity lens. So you'll see the draft that I sent out to everybody has already some edits in there. And we tried to incorporate some language and some changes that would reflect kind of an equity perspective. So we'll be talking about that during our process. And second, we also needed to update our rules to reflect our operational perspective. So as in running any business, you have to kind of take a look at your operations and make sure that things are running smoothly, but that your rules and your policy follow suit as well. So we also had a secondary internal work group take a look at the operational perspective. And that's why we have folks internally from OPRD joining us in the Rule Advisory Committee, so they can lend their experience and expertise on operations and help answer any questions or help kind of discuss what changes need to take place and how that impacts the operation side of running a state park. Any questions on those two internal work reviews? And did everybody here receive a copy of the draft rule in email? Okay, great. Excellent. So the purpose of a rule advisory committee is, again, an administrative purpose that when you open up a rule for updating, that we have a diverse group of individuals with different perspectives come together with the state agency to advise on how to update language, how the rule would impact the communities that they might represent and or help support, and also to review any areas where, from an agency perspective, sometimes we only see things with a certain lens because of who we are as an agency. So to have the public at large a part of the Rule Advisory Committee really does help us gain different perspective. And we want to make sure that this rule, especially because it is the general park rule, does have a wide range of expertise and backgrounds of individuals on our Rule Advisory Committee. And I think that we've done that here. Again, we invited folks from the operational side of park management to join us in this advisory committee because they have a lot of expertise and experience in operating the parks, how it is implemented, how these rules are implemented, how they may confuse park visitors and or areas where we may need to clarify things. So there's a lot that goes into running and operating these state parks. So again, thank you for taking your volunteer time to be a part of the Rule Advisory Committee. We really appreciate you and the time you'll spend with us in the next 3 meetings. Any questions about your role or your perspective? Okay.
I guess one question for me is, are there any like big user groups that aren't represented on this panel? Like, thinking broadly.
I mean, we always try to cast a wide net, and I would say we've probably, don't have representation of every type of large community group out there. But again, I think we went with who responded. I would say in who we have on the Rule Advisory Committee today, it's a wide representation of the community. And then the internal work group that did the equity lens perspective also did an outreach to underrepresented communities in Oregon. I should have mentioned that earlier. So there was a wide net cast there for feedback on that. So some of the updates or the draft language you see also came from the community at large, because we wanted to make sure that wasn't also one-sided, that it was the representation of the community. So yeah, we do a pretty good job of casting a wide net. And then again, timing and understanding and outreach could always be improved. I think that when we talk about some of the other communities, we can still do that in public comment period. So we'll have that happen this fall. All right, let's see. So Caleb is here with us today, and he is not actually a Rule Advisory Committee member, but he is here to share his area of expertise I'll let him explain. Caleb, explain who you are and tell us why you're here and the presentation that you'll be providing to us. You'll do such a better job than I will.
Thanks, Helena. So I'm a research analyst with OPRD, and typically what I research relates to our visitors. So on the one hand, looking at kind of the big picture visitation trends, which parks are popular, reservation trends, and then on the other hand, kind of understanding more about like what visitors do in parks, what are popular activities, and then also kind of understanding demographically who are our visitors, and just trying to have a kind of a broad understanding of who's visiting, what are they doing, and what are we seeing trends wise. And so Helena mentioned to me a number of stay limits that were being considered in Washington state parks. And so I looked into what some of those rules might mean for Oregon state parks. So I'm going to share my screen now and share a little bit of data with you. It does say, Helena, that I think you have to stop sharing maybe. Okay, let's see here. Okay. All right, so the first thing that I looked at was a limit of 90 days per visitor or camper per year, and this is across all parks. So it's just total nights somebody stays in parks across the year. And the way that I can look at this is that we have reservation data, which covers 95 to 99% of our campsite stays. And in that reservation data, we do have a customer ID. So when somebody books, we can use this identifier to kind of break down who's, the unique number of customers. And so in 2022 and 2023, we had a little over 200,000 unique customers each year. And then when we look at how many of those customers stayed 90 or more nights throughout the entire year, it's actually quite small each year. So of the 200,000, a little over 100 customers actually went above this 90-day threshold, which amounts to 0.05% roughly of customers. So it's not very common that folks are staying more than 90 nights throughout the calendar year. Now, from my perspective, I always think of, well, we typically are dealing with people wanting, or we're dealing with a lot of competition for sites. So I did think it would be interesting to look at, if we impose the limit, how much additional, or how many additional nights would be available to general booking, which could be new customers, could be people wanting to try different parks. And so if we were to kind of just say, okay, these folks can still stay 90 days, and then we're chopping off anything that they stay above that 90 threshold, how many nights above 90 basically become open to general booking? And you can see it's pretty consistent for 2022 and 2023 at about 43 to 4,400 nights, which when we look at how many nights get booked across the entire year, these numbers represent about 0.5% of the total bookings. Which, to give you some other perspective, in the summer, like right now, we have about 6,000, between 5,000 and 6,000 campsites available every single night. So this is, less than one full night of inventory in the summer months. So all in all, there's not that many folks who are breaking this limit, and changing it would open up some nights for other people, but it wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact across the park system.
Caleb, there was a question that came in.
Oh.
How do you get this data? Is it by email only, or you had mentioned the reservation system? Is there any other way that you receive this data?
This is through the reservation system, which is it essentially has every campsite transaction across our park system. So when you book a site, it records a transaction, and then that is what we use to monitor this information. And there are a few parks that are not on the reservation system, but if you go by actual quantity, like I said, the reservation system contains 95 to almost 99% of all of our, you could say campsite transactions or nightly stays. Now
Caleb,
oh,
I had a
go
quick
ahead.
question before you jump into any more. I was just trying to get where you got the data, but more than that, it was okay, we're getting up to this 90-day limit, and a lot of those I would assume, but I don't know for sure because I wasn't sure where you got the data. It was going to be our veterans or foster programs that have like free camping. So I was wondering if
that's most likely that's most likely who's extending it. I didn't go through and identify the folks, but in the past, when we've looked at those programs, I would say there's a high likelihood that people going over 90 are in that special access program.
And it looks like we have a question from Pam.
Hey, I was just trying to understand, are the walk-up and non-reservable sites entered into the customer data? And that's how
Yes.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the only data missing is from, what data is missing then?
So there's a few small parks throughout the park system that are not on the reservation system, meaning they don't input each transaction. But if you looked at our total inventory, like I said, we have about 6,000 sites. 95% of those sites are on the reservation system. And then those sites are also more occupied than the walk-up sites in general. So then you could probably say 95 to 99% of all stays are registered in the reservation system. So it's quite comprehensive.
Great. Can I ask a second question?
Yes, of course.
So of the 205 to 210,000 total customers, that is one that represents a reservation that may be 1 to 8 people. Is that correct? Do we have a sense for what the actual total number of people is that's using the park system?
We have so the way we measure visitation is camper nights. So we don't measure in a general sense, we don't measure unique visitors throughout the year. So if you stay at a campsite for 3 nights and it's just you and one other person, so 2 people, 1 campsite, 3 nights, that would be 6 camper nights. And that's how we measure visitation in our park system. We don't normally say how many, because that would in theory only be 2 visitors, but you stayed multiple nights. So we measure the camper nights. We don't measure unique visitors. And our total camper nights for the year is typically around 3 million camper nights. And we've never, because it's not convention in the outdoor recreation world, we've never looked at unique visitors. Again, because one person staying 25 nights is 25 camper nights, but only one unique individual. And so the convention is to measure camper nights, and that's what we've always done. So our transaction data is what allows us to say the unique customers, which I will say, if we do the math, are probably staying on average 3 to 4 nights each, or maybe 1 to 2 nights, and then maybe they have another person at their site. So this is basically from transaction records of identifying unique individuals. I hope that clarifies. Sorry if I made it more
No,
confusing.
that was great. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, if there aren't any other questions on the 90-day limit, there's one other type of limit that I looked into. And this is a 10-day limit per customer or per visitor per park. And this one is actually much more common within our park system. So remember now, when we look at how many times this happens, we're not looking at unique individuals, we're just looking at how many instances did this occur. So one person could have done this more than once. And so in this case, when we look at how many times did one customer book 10 or more nights in a single park in a single month, we see that this is over 10,000 times per year. And it's actually very close from year to year, which makes me think it's probably similar. The people booking kind of a similar trip year to year at about 10,400 times per year. Now, if this limit was imposed, it would, of course, open up a lot more nights to other visitors. So if we took however long these folks were staying, and we just capped it at 10, and then whatever was left over, we opened up to general booking or became available to general booking, this would open up about 47,000 additional nights per year, which is about 5.4% of what our total bookings are year to year. So it's a much larger impact potentially. And given that this larger impact, I decided to look at when would these additional nights become available, because we know that typically the competition for sites is highest in the summer months. So if these new nights became available in the winter, it may not actually impact a lot of customers or visitors. But if they open up in the summer, then you could have a lot more. Basically, you could have a lot more people who are able to find sites who couldn't find sites in the past. And so here on this graph, when I take those 47,000 nights and I look at what month do they become available, you can see here from January on the left all the way to December that a lot of those nights, so essentially what's happening is a lot of folks who are going above this 10-day threshold are doing it in the summer, particularly June, July, and August. And so of the 47,000 nights that would become available with this type of limit, about 30,000 of those would be during the summer months, which represents 7% of our summer booking. So you'd almost think like, imagine if all of a sudden we had 7% of inventory opened up for people looking for campsites. So it could lead to new opportunities for folks who haven't always had those opportunities. A few caveats though. This is a 10-day limit per park per month. So some of these folks will, of course, move to other parks, right? They'll go 10 days at one park, 10 days at another park, maybe even go to a third park within that month. And then another thing that I noticed, which is hard to maybe identify how often this happens, but sometimes one person will book multiple sites for a shorter stay, but they'll be booking for their group. So, if I wanted to stay for 3 nights with, 4 friend groups, I might book 4 sites. Just I'll take care of it. I'll book all the sites for us, 3 nights each, but we're not really there for 10 nights. We're just there for 3, but one person booked them. And the way that we look at this data, I didn't get to that level of detail. So, realistically, the 47,000 nights is probably pretty optimistic, because again, the people booking for groups as well as people booking, people moving just to another park would be another thing that would happen. So I'll kind of stop there on the 10-day limit and see if anybody has any questions.
I'll ask a question. How did you settle on 10 days? And why not 14 or some other number?
It was what Washington State Parks was proposing. So we currently have a rule of our current rule, and if I'm wrong on this, I think maybe Katie would correct me, but it's you can stay 14 nights in a park and consecutively, then you'd have to leave for 3 nights, and then you can come back and stay 14 again. So currently folks can stay almost 28 nights. Like in the month of July, you could in theory stay 28 nights. But it'd have to be 14, leave the park for 3 nights, and then 14 again. So I was just using the 10-night limit because of that Washington proposal.
For what it's worth, on the federal campsites, BLM and state parks, it's 14, and not BLM and Forest Service, it's 14 days. And then you have to move, period. You can't,
Yeah.
there's not an expectation that you'd be gone for 3 days and then come back, but it's just 14 days and then you have to move.
And for what it's worth, if, of course, any higher number of days on this limit would just mean that there'd be these numbers here, the 47,000 would just decline for every day you add to the limit.
In the draft rules that you have, it has 14, but not the 3 out for 3 consecutive days, because that's been very confusing. And we've heard from a lot of our staff that that's hard to track, and we would definitely like to go at least to the 14 that matches federal parks. But when Washington was exploring 10, we thought it was worth looking at, would that offer more opportunity for more people to camp? So that was really the consideration that Caleb was showing us. What would that look like?
Caleb, do you have more on your presentation?
That's all for these two types of limits.
Again, just to reiterate, in our draft rules, as Katie stated, we have the 14 days that is being proposed. However, there's something to consider when following suit with other recreational providers for consistency's sake. I think we find a lot of people like to have consistent stays throughout the REC system, federal, state, from Washington, Oregon, and at the federal level. So things to consider when we get to this point in the rule, but we really did want Caleb to kind of provide this as a preface to that portion that we'll get to. And of course, there's a lot of reasons why people are staying a long time, leaving for 3, coming back for 14 again. And so we'll discuss those things to keep that in mind. But from an operational standpoint and simplicity of campers in, campers out, get the next group in, get the next, and then the experience of stay so that there's more opportunity for others to come and enjoy the park is something else that we're wanting to fold in to make sure that there's access to everybody, that it's not just, limited to certain folks who stay for a longer period of time. So Caleb, there is a question that is up from Steve, if you don't mind hanging back for a little bit.
Yeah.
Just kind of going over the rule from the field point of view, like you said, Katie got to it, it's pretty hard to track this kind of stuff. One thing that we see quite a bit, even though with our 14-day limit, is going to be campers will make a reservation underneath their name and then turn around and put the other reservation underneath their wife's name. It's the same campers. I don't know if that's a way, it's really hard to track that kind of thing. And to be able to say, what are all the names of all your campers in the sites, that would be nearly impossible. But I do try to be consistent with Washington State Parks. Creative public getting around rules.
Oh, yeah. Scott?
Yeah, I was just curious if you looked at it by park, for instance, and I don't know the numbers, at Cove Palisades where Steve's at, or even Lake Oahe, but if you implement the 10-day limit at Lake Oahe, do they have people waiting to get in there? With those vacancies, they would be filled, and I don't know the answer to that. At the coast, I know they would be, right? There's always people trying to get into the coast, but if this was across the board statewide limit, with the other parks, would you see new people coming in?
It's a good question. I think so. In general, in the summer months, every park across the system has pretty high occupancy rates. I could see though, people are, as Steve said, pretty creative. So if you chop things off, they're going to take the best of what's right. So if somebody can only stay 10 nights, they're probably not going to sacrifice a weekend in there. So, if you're opening up, it's some of the parks that are maybe a little bit less popular. If you're just opening up some weekdays, then that might not have as much of an impact. It's still, though, again, in the summer, it'll probably have an impact almost everywhere. But it's possible that some parks wouldn't necessarily completely fill, kind of backfill that. That's for sure. I agree with that.
Kim?
Well, that's sort of the point I was thinking of, that if you impose a 10-day limit, your most frequent user was going to be a Friday through the following week until Sunday. So they're going to take the 2 weekends, and then what you're left with is trying to fill Monday through Thursday, which are probably not going to be as peak. And certainly some people will fill it, but that might reduce these numbers just a little bit.
Jamie?
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think that would be something that I would think of immediately as well. And every park is probably going to be different in this way, but I know that for the parks that I've worked at in the Gorge, surprisingly, like the weekdays don't become less busy than the weekends anymore. And so we have full booking, like fully reserved sites in the summertime through the week. And so we don't actually see any vacancies in our sites just turn over to the next reservation. And so like I said, I really can't speak for all park locations, but I think that it would have less of an impact than what I would initially imagine, with that Monday through Thursday kind of change with the 10-day like you guys are talking about.
Pam,
I'm curious.
Well-
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. If it's not too late to revisit the 90-day, I do think that 7% recovery sounds is pretty compelling. I do also think that well, the reason I think it's compelling is because I think there's a lot of people that can't get into the parks at all because they can only get to them on the weekends and holidays. And so, you know, I appreciate the consistency with the other park systems. But I do see, you know, maybe a future need to get into the nuances of defining, you know, what days are used, or maybe even like good behavior, if you will, in terms of the reservation system. You know, since it's obviously very easy. Well, if you have time to get into you know, tracking when the reservation's open, you know, you can make reservations for long periods of time, past that first date, and then save them and then release them late. Anyway, you know, sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but yeah, I think there's nuances, and I just wonder if you know, how we serve the different user groups. I feel like the people that are limited to the weekends and the holidays are shut out of the system, like altogether, because of that competition. And so if we can reduce the competition on that total limit, maybe we would have more people, you know, able to access the system.
Peta?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different things here going through my head. One, I don't know what this means, but Steve, I was much like you going, oh, there's going to be so many easy workarounds to beat the system, as it were. But also, I'm curious if you ran the numbers for matching, you know, the federal, you know, Forest Service BLM rules versus Washington State Parks. And so it adds just another layer of complexity to know what are the rules here. And, you know, as an Oregonian, I'm like, okay, could they all just agree? So I'm curious if any of that was explored, if that data is available easily or not.
I did not look at, so you're specifically referring to a 14-day limit per park per month? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
I did not look at that, but I can. I will say my hunch. So an interesting thing here. So currently, like I mentioned, we kind of have a 14-day pseudo limit because you can 14 as your stay limit at any park, and then you have to leave. And an interesting thing is that if you look here, you have 47,000, and then here you have 10,000. And so if all of these 10,000 folks or instances are people staying 14 nights, then the extra nights are 4, and 4 times 10,000 gets you to about 40,000. And so I will look into it. My hunch will be that it's going to have a pretty dramatic impact on these 47,000, because I think a lot of people are staying 14. And so when I do my math here, when we cut them off at 10, we're just leaving the 4 days off. And so, so I think that would actually be a really interesting one to look at. And I can get those numbers and send them to Helena to share with you all.
Perfect. Are there any other final thoughts to the data that Caleb's collected? Okay. Thank you so much, Caleb. we'll go ahead and move on to the next topic.
Thank you, Caleb. That was really helpful.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, oh, is there another question?
Oh, one more question.
Yeah, just real quick. I'm curious if we know if the federal land management agencies are also looking at rule changes around camping, or is there any kind of working across those agencies and the state agency?
I haven't heard anything, but it's a national rule, so it would have to get done at the national level. And I'm not sure what all would be involved there.
Yeah, we haven't seen anything specifically for federal parks on around camping state limits. In Washington's, they haven't made that change. They're just considering it in rulemaking currently to go to 10 nights.
Okay, so hopefully, again, thank you to Caleb for providing that data. And it's important to know it's for consideration. Collectively, we'll talk about this, brainstorm. These are really good questions to consider and determine, what recommendations do you make and why. And so I think just having the analysis there really does help. So as soon as Caleb can do the 14-day analysis, then I'll get that data over to all of you to review, and we could discuss that at the next RAC meeting in August. Can everybody see the PowerPoint where it says review draft rule? Okay, great. So you do have a copy there in front of you, hopefully, but I will go ahead and add that to my screen to share. And I will ask if you can see that here in a minute. Can you see the Word document here that I'm scrolling through? Great. Okay. Bear with me for a second. I know scrolling this fast is not ideal. Just want to get to the top of the page. I did a search for stay limits. Took me off of my course. Okay. So a couple of things to consider, and feel free to push back or make suggestions on how you would better see us doing this. But these are the draft rules that we are considering updating. And so we kind of go through these almost, section by section together as a group. And we stop, we discuss, we make updates, we move on. And that's sort of how we run the rule update portion of it. So if that works for everybody, then we can go ahead and proceed. If you have another recommendation, please let me know. Otherwise, we can go ahead and get started. And this is a very lengthy rule. There's a lot of pieces to this rule. So we don't plan on necessarily going through all of it today unless everyone is just gung-ho getting through it all quickly. So let's see how it goes. And again, ask any questions that might come up. Pam, did I see your hand raised? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Just on the big picture, can you just speak a little bit to how these rules relate to other components of the park system, like how the sites are managed for conservation, or if there's any discretion at the local park level, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the general park rules, they're currently called general park area rules. We're going to recommend removing the word area and just call them general park rules, is really intended for the visitor perspective. So for a visitor to understand what rules they need to adhere to when they're staying in the park. And this kind of spells out, any portions of the park properties, what's the difference between a day use park and an overnight campsite. There are different sections within our rules with the Secretary of State that goes into the reservation system specifically, that goes into land conservation in more depth, that goes into the rate setting in more depth. This is just, again, more of a general overview of park rules for a park visitor to understand when they're going to come and visit a state park. So the definitions are broad, the scope of the rule is broad, and again, if it refers to more of a natural resource conservation scope, that's going to be in a different section of our rule in its entirety. But I also think it's important to understand from an enforcement officer what these rules mean to them. So I think I'd like to invite either Jamie or Scott to speak to, how are these rules viewed from a park enforcement officer's perspective, if one of you two don't mind.
I'll go ahead and Scott, if you wanna jump in with anything.
Perfect.
So when it comes to these park area rules, there is, rigidity in them, and then there's flexibility in them with how we enforce them. Just because, like every situation is really dynamic, and there are a lot of gray areas or flexibility with how they are enforced, both in grace given, and if grace can't be given, how we respond with the enforcement tools that we have. So there really isn't a ton that's hard and fast, with the exception of a few. When it comes to things like stay limits, what we were talking about earlier, that's going to be a little bit more rigid, in the sense that we can't we really can't push past folks the rule about stay limits to stay kind of fair for everybody. However, if someone has an extenuating circumstance where, a camper has a medical emergency and they have to go to the hospital, or, anything like that, we have grace to make those decisions to not necessarily enforce that rule in that timeline. So, I hope that kind of answers the question. If there's anything else that I missed or that can be expanded upon, Scott might have some good insight on that.
No, I think that was really well put. We try to enforce the rules as much as possible, but there's always, extenuating circumstances or some things that we might let something slide occasionally. Jamie mentioned a medical condition, but maybe a day use area. If your car breaks down, we'd probably allow you to stay overnight if if you don't have tires on there or something similar. It happens occasionally. So, yeah, I think she put it very well.
Great. Thank you both. Okay. So I think what I mentioned earlier was removing the word area from the rule itself. And then here we can discuss if you think it's a yay or nay. But general park rules, I think it's simple, clean, concise. I think the word area, like what part of the park's area, it just seems to add confusion. So a recommendation is just to remove the word altogether, so it's just clean and simple. How do folks feel about that? A nod of a head, thumbs up is great.
Helena, it looks like Steve has a question.
Yeah, Steve, what are your thoughts?
The only maybe thing we might run into with that is, I know a lot of parks have like a park boundary, but not all of their park boundary is their property. An example is the Cove Palisades State Park. We've got a pretty big area. A lot of that is Forest Service land. A lot of that is BLM land. Yeah, we have a boundary. And then we also contract out with, the deputies or Jefferson County. And I'm not sure how that plays in with our contract with them. Are they still going to be able to say, hey, it's close enough to the park? An example would be someone camping on the side of the road right next to the park, but it's outside the park boundary. That way they're not paying their fees, things like that. But when it says area, at least it encompasses most of that area. I'm just wondering if that jumps into it a little bit or not, if that's the word area is the reason it's in there or not. So.
And I kind of have something similar to what Steve was saying, is that park not all of our parks are parks. In fact, most of my parks aren't technically parks under the legal definition. They're state historic sites or state recreation areas, and nowhere in their official name does it say park. So that might be an issue too.
Thanks, Scott. Really quickly though, just to respond to Steve, we only have authority within a park property. So that's something to keep in mind. So even if folks are, you know, bordering outside the boundaries of our state park property, we only have the authority within the park property itself. So that's just something to keep in mind. Jamie?
Yeah, I was going to kind of echo what Scott said, that we have properties in the gorge that are not developed parks, so they don't have amenities, but there's still properties that we own and that would fall under these Division 10 rules. And so kind of similar, I don't know if this is getting into semantics, but if someone were to challenge a citation or some sort of enforcement action on any of those properties that aren't developed parks, I'm wondering if they could be challenged and thrown out because of the maybe some semantics around it saying park and not something like park area or property or something like that.
Okay. And then a note here, the nuance of areas may need to be added to the definitions of purpose or purpose scope if it was removed. Good point. Okay. So we will hold those. We'll hold it as something for consideration. And again, we'll look back at the remainder of the rule in its entirety. And as we go through the rest of this, we'll see if areas described, properties described, boundaries described, and if it supports this action or not. So we can discuss that here in a minute too. Okay, so no recommendations to changes on purpose and scope of rules, statutory authority. Do folks want a minute to read over this, or have you already read over this? And I can read it out loud too, whatever your preference is.
Already read it.
Okay. So I will scroll down.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, go
Sorry.
ahead.
This might be a good time to just give perspective on how OPRD is working to provide recreational opportunities for a diversity of users. And I'm just curious if, you know, where we were speaking before about the discretion at the park level, the degree to which the agency is doing bias reduction training or has specific strategies. Like, I don't know which parks are accessible, or what percentage of the parklands is like ADA or even, as a natural resource professional, I just see a huge gap in knowledge of everything from water quality to invasive species. And so, interpretation levels at the different parks probably affects, how they're used and how they could be used. So maybe, sorry to be so complicated, but maybe just a little bit of perspective on what the agency does for bias and accessibility. And then, that would just kind of be like a, in the context of, does there need to be some of that in this section?
So bias and
Around maybe reducing bias or, so that would be like internal training, but increasing accessibility maybe would be all you would need to say for. Right.
Okay.
So this is a question to staff, but then I really appreciate that you pointed out this document is the audience are the visitors. And so, if we think about all the different visitors, whether that is, someone who is blind, someone who speaks Spanish, someone who is indigenous, there's a lot of different, you know, the park is a completely different place for all of those different groups. So, maybe something to think about and
Yeah, something that just
revisit.
kind of accentuates some of what our mission already states. So I can appreciate that for sure. Thoughts, Kim?
This section uses the term park properties in multiple places, and it seems like it might be useful to define that. Then you kind of get away from the challenge of general park area rules or park rules, or it avoids that semantic discussion perhaps.
Good point. I'm just scrolling down just to see if we have park property defined here, and it is. So park property means any state park, natural area, greenway, wayside, corridor, scenic area, monument, historic structure or area, trail or recreation area under the jurisdiction of the department.
So it's there. My bad for not finding it.
Oh, it's totally fine. But again, we kind of duplicate the word area in there, and we have to potentially consider removing that if we remove it from the title, or leave it if we leave it in the title.
But that's the legal classification for some park properties would be state historic area or state recreation area.
Or maybe we want to move property to where it says area. I'm just wondering if park property if that's the terminology, if we wanted to bump it up into the title. Anyway, just food for thought.
So hold that thought. I'm going to scroll up and tell me if the scrolling is bothering you, or you'd like me to do that offline, because I know that it can be bothersome too. So we could.
It's fine.
Okay. So we could potentially use the word property to be considered. Okay.
I'm a fan of park area rules. I think it adds a little bit of generality to it implies a broad scope, and where park property doesn't really do that for me. So I'd be inclined to leave it in.
Okay. All right. So right now it's not going anywhere, but we will hear back and we'll go back and forth on it. Okay. So any other further thoughts on the purpose and scope of the rules and statutory authority, section 555 here? If not, I'll scroll down. Gives kind of the background of our authority and then the public use. All right, so definitions. Definitions is obviously a very important section of any rule because it really helps define and make it clear to anybody what the definitions of the certain sections are. If not defined, it's left to interpretation. And of course, that can be part of the misunderstanding sometimes. So certain areas, I mean, it's very important to the agency because we've had circumstances. And so I'll lean to the operations staff to kind of jump in and offer some insight if there needs to be any kind of further explanation. But with boat, for number one, we really wanted to define that by the Oregon revised statute that it means all watercrafts. Because I'm assuming people will argue what is and isn't considered a boat. So we just base it back on the Oregon revised statute itself of any or all watercraft. we removed day use area and district manager from up here because we moved it further down, so that will come soon. Camping is a very, very important definition to the agency. Here we define it as means the erecting of a tent or shelter, preparing bedding for use, parking of a motor vehicle, RV, or other similar equipment, or mooring of a vessel for the apparent purpose of overnight occupancy. And I'd like to discuss this a little bit because, you know, camping does mean a lot of things. So are we missing anything here? I open it up to any comments or thoughts from agency staff or other members of the advisory group. Any other thoughts on camping unit? Like, do we need to potentially define the camping unit itself? And we'll get to that in a minute. Jen?
I don't know about necessarily describing the camping unit, but I'm wondering if it's an issue as to whether the camping is recreational versus more of a living situation. If there's any concern for that and need to shore that language up, or if it doesn't matter. I guess I bring it up from my perspective with much of the population we work with in our mental health office is unsheltered. And I hear about the difficulties they have in finding somewhere safe to stay. And so I don't know if these campgrounds are inclusive to that, or if that's an issue that needs some wording to make sure these camping sites are attracting the populations that as intended.
Yeah, we haven't differentiated the reason why someone's camping, just the behavior of the use of when they're camping. So we do obviously know that many folks who are staying overnight are doing so for shelter needs. The park is designed for recreational purposes. And so I think we just need to hold that in scope, but then also I want to invite Jamie to maybe see if she has a response to this from an operational perspective too.
Yeah, so and Steve and Scott probably also have some input on this as well, but you know, for me, the motivation and reason behind someone camping is less of a concern or no concern really, and more just, you know, are the park area rules being followed by everyone that's camping? So, you know, if someone is utilizing a campsite for, you know, I'm gonna use the word subsistence. I don't know if that's that's probably not the right word, but is actually, you know, using it as kind of like a de facto residence versus someone who is out for the weekend, you know, camping for recreation. Both user groups, you know, don't concern me until there's a violation of park rules, like, you know, no pay, or you know, someone starts a campfire during burn ban or something like that. Then we're going to address those rule violations. But otherwise, the actual reason for someone recreating in the park, it really kind of makes no difference to us. Just that everyone is, you know, being respectful and following park area rules.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Jamie. We also have contractors, you know, that are working on jobs in remote locations that maybe staying at the parks occasionally. That's another, you know, they're not really there for recreation, but as long as they're following all the rules, that's great with us. I did have a houseless person point out to me once that they also recreate. And I was like, okay, you're right. I didn't think about that. It made me, kind of change my perspective on things quite a bit, that conversation. But yeah, so as long as they're following the general park area rules, they're good.
Yeah, for me, it's pretty well set by those two already. But definitely keeping in mind, and it's probably why Washington is trying to knock it back to 10 days or 14 days. It might be a possibility though, trying to hunker down on people living in the parks. But yeah, it doesn't matter. As long as they're there, they follow the rules, pay. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, so otherwise everyone's pretty content with the actual definition of camping? Great. So in here's a little note about, do we need to define camping unit? And think about what Caleb did talk about during his presentation and kind of the questions that came up. We don't know how many people are in that unit. Sometimes people in the unit book under their own name, and then somebody else in that site books under their name. And so, is there a need to define a camping unit? Camping unit is typically a vehicle, and that's normally what we refer to as a camping unit. But camping unit can be multiple different things. So it could be not a vehicle, but it could be just a person. It could be the type of vehicle it is. How broad do we want to leave the terminology for camping unit, or do we want to define it here? Because I think the other thing to consider too is camping, what people are camping in is getting pretty creative too. Not just an RV, but also like the big vans that are outfitted to be a camping van. Any thoughts from an operational perspective to add some substance to this portion when it comes to camping unit? Jamie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so camping unit, just so I understand, in the definition of camping unit, it's going to be something like a tent, an RV, like that, like basically whatever someone is housed within in their campsite.
Right.
I see. So if it's in reference to, like it says here in the notes, how many in a site are allowed, the difference between, say, an RV and a tent is different. And so I know that, like, we allow one RV per site, but you can have multiple tents per site. And so if that's the definition, we might need to do something to address that part of it, but I don't know.
I think the challenge we've had raised is the definition of, and it's sort of an RV of what do we, when we say only one camping unit per site or one RV per site, what do we consider as people are sleeping in lots of different things and then they bring multiple to a site? So that was the thought around having a definition for the sleeping, and maybe sleeping unit is better. Or something that, because we have people sleeping in different types of vehicles that aren't necessarily RVs.
Steve?
They may not be able to be defined under the same thing. Like an RV and a tent shouldn't be defined under a single term, just because like a tent, you can have multiple tents on a site, you can have one RV on a site. So I think that having one term for all of it doesn't fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to agree with that. Every different person that's visiting the park is going to come in a different kind of vehicle or something like that. A lot of that occupancy stuff is you can't necessarily have two RVs in a site if it's a power spot. It's going to trip the breaker. It's overloading the capacity on the site. So tents don't necessarily always have power, don't have water. It's just a tent. Saying that, it also helps us limit the amount of people coming to one site. You may only have 6 people that can fit there, but where are all the 6 different cars going? Or if they all carpooled there, there's a lot of different stuff that comes in when you say camping unit. Um, yeah, that part of it, I get the different kind of vehicles and the different camping that people are doing. It definitely, to make it across all the state parks, that camping unit part is definitely a difficult thing to track. And also when you get on our reservation system, it does ask how many people are in the site. There's an actual column for that. But to be able to fill that out at the booth is nearly impossible, because if the person is checking in right there, how many people are in the RV? Well, there's two because you can see two, but then four more people are showing up tomorrow. Another two people are showing up the next day, and they're all leaving on the 7th. It's really hard to keep track of the number occupancy that's in there. And that's why most parks within this region anyway don't necessarily fill that out, because you don't know how many people are actually going to be in the site besides the one person that booked it. They're going to be there. That's about it.
And that speaks to how Caleb was collecting his data too, right? Okay.
Is there a need to define camping unit? Because, is that used in other places in the document? Because I think above it, where you've talked about camping, you have defined all of the possible uses, or all of the possible ways people could be there. They could sleep in their car, they can sleep under a blanket, they can be in an RV or some kind of boat. That's pretty comprehensive up above.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, do you have another thought, or is your hand still just raised from the last time?
It's raised from the last time, sorry.
No worries. Yeah, we may not need to define it. And I think I'm going to suggest something. We can go through the rules. We can kind of skip the definitions part, and we can go through the rule and then go back to definition to kind of guide us and cross-reference some of this language. Does that make sense? Because then it will be put into context. I think that might help us as we're going through the rules to see how we're using some of these terms, and then it might trigger us to come back and say, well, wait a minute, you're using the word camping in this context. How is it defined again? Or maybe, yes, we do need to look at redefining or adding a definition for camping unit. So just a suggestion, if that's something that you're comfortable doing, we can bypass this section and come back to it as we need to. Kim? You're on mute. Sorry, Kim.
Sorry. If we do skip the definitions, there's one spot where we are not super consistent, and that is number 32, RV. We have the word RV, but then back in section, well, at the very top of page 14, the first paragraph refers to a recreational vehicle, which isn't defined anywhere. So we solved that problem by just changing the top of page 14 to RV.
Okay. Instead of recreational vehicle.
Right.
Have it RV here suggested in definitions. So yeah, we can just change the top of 14 just to say RV. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but there is one issue with the RV thing. How would you define a camper? It's not a motor vehicle and it's not a trailer.
I would think, wouldn't the DMV have a definition that we'd want to be consistent with?
Let me see if I can go back. Sorry. I wanted to add a note to that and it just threw me up to the top. I won't add notes anymore, folks. Sorry. So RV, I will look to ODOT's definition. And I think, yeah.
You could just solve the problem by saying motor vehicles, campers, or trailers with living areas intended for, and then you've solved the problem.
Say that again, Kim.
RV means motor vehicles, comma, campers, comma, or trailers with living areas.
like that.
Yeah.
And we can also add the or similar type vehicles, and then that's kind of the catch-all language.
And I like the catch-all because you know they're going to come out with different types of vehicles that we haven't even predicted. So
Probably before the ink is dry on this thing.
true, true. And I think to Steve's point is the multiple vehicles or multiple RVs can disrupt the breakers, so the power supply, right? And so if you have an EV vehicle with an RV in the same site, both kind of taking power from the source, that trips the breakers. And so again, needing to understand and define some of these things is really important to the operational side of things and for providing the infrastructure to support the camping experience. Okay. Any other thoughts of skipping the definitions here and just going straight into the rule? Is that okay? Thumbs up? Okay, Scott, you had one thought?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, real quick, I'm good with skipping the definitions, but you might want to check the OAR for master plan, 660034. I'll send it, put it in the chat. 0040, because it does have some state park definitions and allowed uses that we're covering here. I don't know how much is similar, but there, some of it is covered.
Excellent.
And also, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but I also just as a RAC member, like I personally, if as like an overall edit in between this and the next meeting, you wanted to do a search on, just some of the terms in the dictionary and then check for their consistency, so,
Right.
And then make those changes like that. I don't think we can do that as a committee.
Right. Yep. Okay.
And for a little background on some of those definitions too, I believe it was just before COVID, we were reviewing this, and the reason we're adding a lot of definitions is because we realized that they weren't in here. We defined a lot of things, but we didn't define boat, for instance, and I know that's why it was added in there, and that's why there's so many definition changes.
Thanks for that, Scott. Like I said, the rule, again, the need to update the rules every 5 years, and this was definitely outdated. And so we really needed to update our housekeeping on that. So the definitions is a big part of that. Okay, so general regulations, section 20 here, and I'm just saying section 20 is the last 4 digits of the rule itself. So we're proposing in section 2, under A, the maximum length of stays for campers is 14 nights in a 30-night span per park property.
I believe that is consistent with the federal rules.
Yeah. Based on Caleb's presentation earlier today, based on knowing that this is consistent with federal rules, any thoughts about this? Suggestions, changes, or keep it?
From an operation standpoint, I'm fine with 14 or 10. I think that getting rid of this consecutive and changing the 17 to a 30-night period is going to be the most important from like operationally speaking. But that's just my opinion.
Say it probably doesn't matter, depending on the park you're talking about. Again, there's so many different parks. If it's the middle of October and you've got all empty sites, you're telling the person they have to move, and at some point there's no one else in the park. It may seem silly, but it's a rule. Go ahead and leave and come back. Just wanted to make that point. At some point, we're not always full. Obviously, in the summertime, this is what we use to get more visitors out to the park.
So is there any language that we can introduce that provides that discretionary decision-making, Steve? Because yeah, it makes sense to keep the visitor there if there isn't any competition, right? But again, what would that language look like? And does it open us up to other kind of misinterpretation?
I think it's probably in there because it could be misinterpreted, and then it's also, hey, now I get to decide how long this person could stay there. So I think it's a lot better to have it, hey, hard rule matches federal laws in the area, things like that. But I just wanted to make that point that it's one of those things where you're looking for another camp spot for this person before you have to go up and tell them they have to move. So
Well, Steve, wouldn't you have the discretion to waive the rule in a situation like that?
I don't know
I mean, it
that I
seems like very-
necessarily do.
If there's not like if the my understanding is that if it was based on occupancy, just that the campground is kind of empty, that we don't have really the discretion to make that call. It's more in extenuating circumstances where someone can't physically move, like there was like a medical emergency, like I had talked about earlier. But that's something to look at. Like, so for instance, on the coast or in certain areas, in the shoulder seasons, they can stay just as busy, but in some other park areas, when there's more empty occupancy, I think that there could be an internal conversation about, without manager approval or something being added. So if you do have campgrounds with less occupancy, maybe there could be exceptions made. But that also kind of can sometimes get into, if folks are occupying a site for an extended length of time, sometimes there can be, I don't know how to word it, but some kind of ownership of the site that can happen. And so sometimes these like a really extended stay can be problematic because sometimes it can be more disruptive to someone to then ask them to move later on. So it just kind of depends. It depends on the park, I think.
Does that discretion open you up to any kind of issue in the future where you could be, as a manager, making a discretion to decide that maybe a camper who's overstayed their welcome because maybe they're disruptive may need to leave? And that leans, I guess you have other rules to support that decision making though, don't you? So if somebody needs to cool off or leave, you can impose that. This is just strictly for extended stays. Sorry, I was just thinking out loud for a minute. Pam did offer on chat, would this language be feasible unless a site has less than 50% occupancy? And do we want to put
The other reason for the 14 nights is from a conservation natural resource perspective, that it allows a campsite to then regenerate. In theory, if it's not reserved the next night, then it allows us to clean up and have that site vacant for a little bit of time. And for our campsites that aren't full all of the time, those winter months give them some time to regrow. So just because they're not booked doesn't mean there's not a benefit.
You're right, Katie. There are like heavily used federal campgrounds that sometimes have to go through periods where they just stay closed because their sites have a lot of usage, and that where, the compaction and all that stuff can have negative impact on the sites. And so having periods of no occupancy is good from a natural resource perspective, but also like a user experience perspective over time.
So based on that information, are we okay with leaving it the way it is?
I guess I was just throwing in the chat. I'm totally in support of limiting the length to 10 days. I see benefits for site recovery, for site management, and yeah, just general safety. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else in favor of limiting this to 10 days? Jamie? Anyone else? Okay. So far, folks the majority says about 14 days. And we can come back to this. All right, so the next section, the maximum length of stay for a hiker, biker, boater site is 2 nights in a 7-night period per park property. So is everyone here familiar with the hiker, biker, boater sites? Raise your hand if you'd like an explanation, and I'm sure Scott would be happy to describe hiker, biker. Okay, hi, Scott, you're on. He lost us for a minute, but he's back.
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know if it froze, so I lost you for a bit. Yeah, we have many sites across the state that are just exactly what they said, hiker, biker, boater, that you can walk into or bike into. I know Stubb Stewart has a few. We have many along the Willamette River that they're boat-in campsites or camp spots that you can go to. And so they generally have a lot less amenities than a standard campsite. Maybe just running water, maybe just a picnic table. We do have some of the Willamette that don't have anything, but we allow you to camp there. And I'm not sure what the change, why they backed it up from 3. I don't know any background on that. But for my sites that I manage, most people are traveling, they're moving through the river corridor and have a certain amount of time to get from space to space. So I do see people camp on the Willamette, more than 1 night, but rarely more than 2. They're in there because they have a short window span and they have a destination that they got to get to where all their cars are.
Thanks, Scott. Katie, do you have some background on from 3 to 2 nights?
Yeah, I can just the discussion for context about why that was proposed was these sites are meant to be for travelers. So a lot of them are when people are doing through hikes on the Oregon Coast Trail, or they're hiking someplace. So the thought was a night to rest. So a 2-night made sense, but they weren't intended for people staying long term. So that was the intent behind 2 nights instead of 3.
Do we need to define a hiker, biker boater campsite anywhere?
In the rates rules, it is we describe it because we charge for that site, so it's described there.
And is it
the definition, but it's specifically defined of what that site type is, and there's a rate for that site type.
And they're labeled accordingly at the parks?
Yes.
Okay.
Folks agree with the 2 nights stay in a 7-night period?
I'm curious if someone was accessing these sites because of a cultural need or practice, and they were limited to 2 nights, and it impacted that practice. I mean, that's the exception. I think boaters are going to do their thing, hikers are going to do their thing. And what about the cultural, potential cultural implications of particular sites that you can only access by river or trail?
I would say, we would work with them just like we would pretty much any wood. to allow them to do what their ceremony or practice that you're talking about is whatever space and time they need to do that. And kind of would do something similar because these are a lot more flexible sites than say the campground on a reservation. If I pull up to a site and a boater says, well, we actually need 3 days because I don't know if someone's going to catch up with us, we would allow that. So probably just working through that, communicating with them, but we would definitely allow it.
I don't have any problem with 3 nights. Because I can see instances where somebody's just really tired and needs to recover for a little longer than 2 nights.
And Ketha, we do have tribal relations policy and traditional use policy as well. And we worked with the tribes to define those policies, and they'll basically like traditional use and cultural use and ceremonial use is all within scope, and it's just a matter of communicating with the park manager. So there's a lot of flexibility with that. 3 nights are really fine. There's really not a huge concern for us in general. So we can keep it at 3 nights. If everyone is comfortable with that, we can go back to 3. And I think it helps support kind of considering the diversity of users, right? So to Kim's point, some people might need an extra day of just respite if they're passing through on a bike, on a hike, whatever it might be. And so really kind of considering the user's need to have an extra day of respite. I can appreciate that for sure too. From a cultural perspective too, I think there's a lot of reasons why people come and go. And then Steve and Jamie and Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of times we don't ask why people are coming through. We're just like, hey, how are you guys doing? Is everything good? If you need anything, let us know. But we're not always asking why people are there. It's their recreational experience, and we just want to make the park safe and welcoming for everybody. But I can appreciate the need for three nights. Thoughts, Pam?
I think any number is fine. I'm hearing a number of exceptions though, and I'm not, and I think accessibility would be fostered through clarity. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to get into this document the pieces of either the site manager's discretion, cultural accessibility supports, and maybe even the other rates definitions that were mentioned. Like, if there's a way to have, see exceptions, and then if exceptions is in the definitions, and this is just one idea, I'm just trying to figure out how to like get this, the caveats that I'm hearing for the different pieces kind of in this document. So like one exception could be hiker, biker, boater is defined in the rates rules, or anyway, yeah, maybe we can use the term exceptions to describe the flexibility that are in these site limits.
I think too, I personally would like some input for maybe the coastal managers. So I have, almost 8,000 acres along the Willamette River that's open for camping, and it's very easy to find a spot. It's very secluded. Generally, you feel like you're in the wilderness, even though you're not. It's a really nice, great outdoor experience. So we don't have an issue with needing space for more people, but maybe with the popularity of the coastal trail, that might be a little bit different with their visitation there. So the 2-day limit may be more important there. And I just don't have that information.
Okay. That's a good point, Scott, because I know there's a lot of really high occupancy areas where, we really need people to leave. So it opens it up for others to come through. And the Oregon Coast Trail is a big, very popular location for that. So definitely something to consider. And I don't know, Katie, if you know if that 2-day came from a coastal operations perspective or not.
I believe that that's where it was, but I don't recall for sure. And I think if we take out the consecutive, that was the biggest concern. Is just wanting to make sure that people aren't using them to stay for a very long time. So the 3 nights, I don't think will be a huge issue.
Okay. All right. Moving on further down in section 4, a person shall observe and abide by all instructions, warnings, restrictions, and prohibitions on posted signs and notices and verbally communicated from park employees. Any thoughts on the added language on verbally communicated? I think sometimes there's an understanding that the population that we're serving may or may not have seen a sign, read a sign, is capable of reading, is from a different language perhaps. And so we have different languages that are also spoken from park employees. So some of that verbal communication is a part of this as well. It encompasses that. Any thoughts, or if you're good, we can move on. Just thumbs up. Okay. Number 6. A park manager or department enforcement officer may order any person that violates any state park rule to leave a park property or group of park properties. And we have an exclusion rule that we have just adopted recently that speaks to this section, and the group of park properties was something added in the exclusion rule because sometimes a person needs to be excluded from multiple park properties in an area, depending on what their violation, what they're excluded for. So that was added just to kind of support the exclusionary rule. We're good with that. Thumbs up. Cool. Further down in number 12, peace officers may cite under the situations for criminal trespass in the 2nd degree, a Class C misdemeanor, or Oregon Rule Revised Statute. Jamie, Steve, Scott, you guys want to define peace officer? And we should have, this is defined in rule too.
Yeah, I believe our definition uses the term enforcement officer, right? Above. Does it define peace officer?
Yeah, the peace officer is just fine because that's the law enforcement piece.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so that's defined. Go ahead, Jamie.
I mean, and this may be semantics, but is peace officer the term that we want to go with? Just because I mean, I don't know that any of us actually verbally, when we talk about being commissioned officers, that we don't use that terminology. And does that kind of start to get confusing if that's not a term that we generally use?
I think peace officer is just overwhelming. It grabs, okay, so I've got deputies that I pay to be able to go out and make contacts with people. No, it grabs those deputies. If you call them peace officers, you don't want to. That's my guess on it anyway, Jamie.
I
Peace officers is the term used, and OARs and ORS is to refer to all law enforcement officers.
Yeah, so it's kind of all encompassing.
This one is in here to just make it clear that our enforcement officers write for violations, but law enforcement rights can cite for criminal trespass.
Cool. All right, under violations, and we have about 15 minutes left, so I think we'll go for another five or seven, and then we'll move on. And then wherever we stop is where we'll start back up in our second rule advisory meeting. So under violations and fines, everything is pretty much the same. We updated section 4 here, or number 4, to a class A violation so that it's accurate. In 6A, we removed the actual fine amount. Fines change over time, and if we actually have a fine amount written that is not accurate, then that citation is kicked out. So we wanted to be sure that we weren't being very prescriptive on the fine amount so that our citations are not kicked out of a court hearing or case. That makes sense. Good with those? Moving on. Okay. Next section, 25. For under motor vehicles, number 1, violation of this rule is a class B violation unless park resources are damaged, resulting in a class A violation. Any questions on this one? Number 2, all park area roadways are considered public highways, and all provisions of the Oregon Vehicle Code are applicable and enforceable on such highways. So again, just cleaning up the language so that's reflective of how we name the roadways. Section 4, we just removed the language on violation of this rule as a class B violation. Is there a thought?
No, I just wanted to make sure up there at roadways, highways, I need, as we describe them usually when we're talking to people already, we use highways, it's a state highway, but I just wanted to make sure there's not any backlash on technicalities, meaning a highway has to be a certain width, that kind of thing, has to be striped a certain way, all that kind of stuff. I just wanted to make sure we weren't getting into something different there, but obviously I don't know all the technical things behind that.
Good point. Because for us too, it could be a dirt road, no striping, gravel roads, whatever. And so we can go back and verify. I'll go back here and just make sure that it's clear that it encompasses all of our road types. Okay. I'll do that and then I can report back in our next meeting. And highway is in the definitions Pam shared. And the definitions of this rule, Pam, or yeah. So we
Yes.
can go back there and look really quick. Or do you want to read it to us, Pam, if you don't mind?
Highway means every public way, road, street, thoroughfare, and place, including bridges, viaducts, and other structures within the boundaries of this state. Looks like punctuation could be needed. State, comma, open, comma, used or intended for the use of the general public for vehicles or vehicular traffic as a matter of right, as described in ORS 801.305. So it's something to be looked at.
Okay. We'll cross-reference that too. Okay, number 10, maintenance or repair of vehicles is prohibited on park property without manager approval. And I will allow Steve and Jamie and Scott to speak to this. There's a lot of nuances to this one that we just want to be super clear on. And then we can end after this and move on to wrap things up. What happens in the park with these vehicles?
This is one that I added in there actually, so I'll be happy to jump in on it. And I don't think I had repair in there originally when I brought this up. It was maintenance, and for me it was actually scheduled maintenance. Like I would pull up to one of my parks and someone would be doing an oil change in the parking lots, versus being broken down. That, you know, it's a very different activity. When they're broken down, we generally would assist them to, you know, to the best we could, versus a planned car maintenance event that they're, you know, have just come out to the park because they need some space to do it.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of Scott, that is how we enforce it. If someone, you know, like on 4th of July, I had an RV that had a tire blowout and needed to patch the spare, inflate the spare, put it on, and then it also like kind of destabilized their black water, and so they had to fix that before they could get back on the road. That kind of thing, completely fine, and we never bulk at that at all. It is more like someone comes out and is just kind of tinkering with their car, because we have a bigger parking lot, or doing an oil change, and the spill is the thing that we are concerned about. So yeah.
No, I definitely agree with him. You know, the maintenance thing is what, you know, Scott was talking about. That makes a lot of sense. And if they are broken down, I'd love them to repair their vehicle and move it so they're gone.
So we're good with the language maintenance or repair?
I personally would pull out repair. I'm sorry, whatever.
Yeah,
Allergy medicine, I can't even think straight.
no worries. Because repair is when something's broken down, you want them to fix it, you want them to go. But maintenance is something scheduled. They're having.
Yes.
What about washing an RV? I've seen kind of the fancier RV resorts have people that come out and wash people's RVs on the spot, like a mobile RV washing unit. Do you see those in the parks?
I don't know if
Haven't
we,
seen that.
I don't know if
Yeah.
we see that as much, but you just see the visitors washing their boats or washing their RVs while they're in their site, which I don't know that us coming around telling them they can't wash their boat or their car is going to be a thing. If they paid for the spot, they paid for the utilities there, they should probably be able to do that.
Yeah, the
was
washing the
Vegas.
boat, I don't mind as much, just because that could also be like an invasive removal situation. We ask folks to like clean off their boat before they leave the area, but I haven't seen the washing the RV. I could only see that becoming an issue with like what products are they washing it with, and how is it leaving the site after the fact, like with, you know, like sudsy stuff like flowing. But I've not encountered that enough to really be able to say.
I haven't either, and it might be a park by park basis where some of the dry side parks where they have limited access to water, that might be more important than, say, the Willamette Valley, at least currently.
Okay.
I mean, as a park user, I would be concerned about people using any kind of chemicals more than like, you know, a quarter cup or less, that they were distributing them, you know, into the environment from their site. To me, that's going to be high impact for water quality and habitat, and also potential other park users, like with fragrances. And like, to me, it's not a consistent park use. You know, is it recreation? Okay, well, you know, people can find cleaning fun, but you know, people don't get to do every type of recreation at the park, right? They just get to do, I mean, the goal is recreation for everyone, and that's outdoor recreation, not, well, yeah, anyway, I guess.
I was gonna say, let me piggyback on that, what Pam said. Part of that OAR too, I think Pam said consistent park use, but that AOR for park master plans has a list of uses that are allowed at day use parks. It's not all inclusive, but that also might be referenced there, or, you know, if it's not something that's referenced in that other AOR, then maybe that shouldn't be happening.
Okay. All right, so I will stop here and we will resume at the next meeting.
Hey,
Okay.
Helena,
go
before
ahead.
you stop, we've got a numbering issue in that section.
Right. Yeah, the numbering and as soon as we go through all of our edits, then we'll go back and fix all the numbering. Because that's
Okay.
definitely, yeah. Try to ignore those as best you can, because we will fix those.
Okay.
All right, so kind of the process here is what we're doing now is reviewing and discussing and making recommendations. This, as you can see from today, it takes time. We'll go through this, we'll discuss things, we'll brainstorm. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of good feedback coming from all perspectives. This group will talk about what racial equity and impacts there are to fiscal and economic as well. Today, we'll kind of ask if there's a racial equity impact in a minute. We'll have a public comment period later this fall, and then we will report our outcome and recommendations to the commission later this year as well. So just a heads up on what our plan is with the rule. But for today, and we did talk about this a little bit, we'll hold off on racial equity until the next meeting just because we're running short on time. So we did have some conversations about that earlier, which I appreciate because it's a really important part of our rule updating process. We want to make sure that we are really acknowledging any racial equity impacts. So keep that in mind for the next meeting. We'll discuss that there, as well as the fiscal and budget impacts too. So our next meeting is August 8th from 9 till 11, and it will also be Zoom. So if you see a Teams link, ignore it. I will make sure and try my best to delete it before I send out that email reminder. It will be a Zoom link. And the third RAC meeting is scheduled for August 29th, also via Zoom from 10 to noon. Again, public comments will be set to open this fall, and we will share all of our comments and recommendations to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department Commission in the fall after public comments, and we'll make recommendations to them for the proposed rules. And the commission's position would be to either vote to adopt our recommendations as rule, or they can make amendments and based on the comments that we receive from the public. So the commission has the right to kind of say, hey, this is a really important comment. There's a lot of consistency with it, so they can make recommendations for change, or they can ask us to open up public comment for a longer period of time to kind of cast a wider net. So that's really an opportunity that may unfold, or they may choose not to go forward with the recommendations, and then we kind of start the process over again. So just a heads up on what that looks like. Are there any questions before we wrap up our first Rule Advisory Committee? Well, I want to thank all of you for all of your time. I appreciate that you took 2 hours of your time to be a part of this discussion today. Very important, very impactful to all visitors of state park properties. And I think too, like as we had the first round, you kind of see the process of what it's about. Cross-referencing is really important. Knowing where definitions live and how they apply to the rule is really important as well, and perspective. So again, I want to thank all of you, and stay cool out there as the weather warms up. And I look forward to seeing you again in about a month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.